Thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon. So this is part of our new guides training, but as part of that we're doing a series of four talks on 20th century art, so covering sort of the century from the beginning of the 1900s up to present day, just to kind of give everyone a little bit of context for the artworks that are on display in the gallery. So I'd like to introduce you to Head of Displays at Tate Modern, Matthew Gale, who will be giving us the talk today. Matthew.
Thank you. I'm just going to leave at this stage. This is a slightly thrown together talk, and slightly perhaps cutting across the linear structure that Anthony refers to. I was gathering some interesting facts and quotations about 3 minutes ago, and I suddenly looked at my watch and thought, ought to actually crack on and get here. So slightly thrown together, as I say, but let's see how it goes. I'm going to start with some dips back in time. So this was probably billed to you as sort of covering the period 1930 to 1970. Maybe not, I don't know. We'll see how we go. But it is 100 years today since Marcel Duchamp, or someone purporting to be Marcel Duchamp, submitted this object to the Independence exhibition in New York. And it is a sort of critical moment in the ways of thinking about artworks, and this seemed like a good place to start. And I've picked up a few other sort of anniversaries as we go on. That whole scheme actually falls apart as the talk continues, but we'll start in that place at least. So what did he do? We have a work that was an ordinary urinal, or seems to be, that was turned on its back, submitted to an exhibition which was run by an association which proclaimed itself as not having restrictions on the ways in which works were exhibited. So there was essentially no jury making decisions about what was allowed in. If you were a member of the Independents, you could show what you liked. There was a sort of hanging committee, and Duchamp, in fact, was the person hanging the exhibition that year. But one or two of the other members of the hanging committee thought that this was outrageous, and they got together in a sort of impromptu committee meeting and decided to ban it. And Duchamp immediately resigned, along with Walter Arensberg, who was a rich, eccentric poet and cultural figure in New York at the time. Later well known for believing that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's works, which an activity he poured his money into. And then subsequently, as many of you will know, giving his collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is why there are so many works by Marcel Duchamp and Constantin Brancusi, who we'll come on to in a moment, in Philadelphia. So, controversial moment. The association with Duchamp is, in a sort of Duchampian way, quite at a distance. So he didn't own up to being the person submitting this. And those of you who keep your eye on the various art world controversies may be aware that there's currently a fairly impressive move to reattribute this work to Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoffen, who was a German artist working in New York in Duchamp's circle. And that's because Duchamp at this moment wrote to his sister, who was in Paris, saying that a friend, une amie, a female friend, had submitted this work to the Independents. And so there's a bit of a little, quite minute controversy about whether Duchamp has subsequently absorbed this into his work and excluded Elsa from the scene. What's significant, though, is that on the same day, actually, the day that the Independence opened, on the 10th of April 1917, a periodical called The Blind Man was published by 3 editors, one of whom was Duchamp, in which he made the famous statement, or which the famous statement was published, that Armut may not have made this work, but he chose it. And that becomes the sort of core statement for a strand of conceptual art over the next 100 years. The idea that the handmade was no longer as important as the intellectual. And Duchamp was famous for really trying to set aside the idea that artists were ignorant, sensual beings, and he was very much more acting on the cerebral plane. So this becomes the sort of founding moment of a process of art making across the rest of the century. So is this going to work? No. I thought I'd put up next another work that we have on display upstairs, and this is sort of standing in for another controversy, because I've already suggested that Duchamp and Brancusi knew each other quite well. As well as being a cerebral artist, Duchamp virtually acted as a dealer, and that's only sort of come out in the studies of his life after, since his death. And in particular, he was an agent for Brancusi, whose main market was in the United States. So Brancusi, based in Paris, making really primarily marble carvings and some works in bronze. Found his market in the United States in the interwar period. And the next controversy, oh, hello, is actually conveniently 90 years ago, in 1927, when Brancusi fought a court case by proxy with the United States Customs. He had sent a bird, not this actual bird, but one of the more streamlined bronze birds, to an exhibition in New York. It was actually Edward Steichen, the photographer who owned this work, the Maestra, who took up the court case when the United States Customs decided to class the bird as an industrial object rather than an artwork. So there you got another step in how one tries to define modern art. Interestingly, Duchamp's sort of in the background, probably egging Brancusi on to take on this court case, and significantly he was supported in the United States by a major collector called John Quinn, who was collecting Brancusi's work, but conveniently also was a major lawyer. So Quinn fought the case against United States Customs, and the Customs basically said, well, this is a piece, effectively like a sort of missile. It's a piece of polished bronze. Make your case for this being an artwork. And slightly in contradistinction to Duchamp's fountain, Brancusi made a statement to the American Embassy in November 1927, in which he said, "I did not allow anybody else to do any of this finishing work on the bronze, polishing, etc. As the subject of the bronze was my own special creation, and nobody but myself could have carried it out to my satisfaction." So slightly the other way round for the situation a decade earlier. Brancusi's basically making the claim for a multiple object, because it was a cast bronze, needing his own hand finish, quite in distinction from what the case that Duchamp made around Richard Mutt. Nevertheless, that court case helped to broaden the ways in which art was defined, slightly peculiarly that definition needing to come through the courts rather than through other means. And then another anniversary. Last Thursday, Leonora Carrington would have been 100 years old had she still been alive, and so I thought I would put up the image of the small drawing that we have currently on display. So this is another just convenient way of linking bits and pieces together. Carrington, as many of you will know, is a British artist who spent most of her working life in Mexico, associated with Surrealism. And in, again, another convenient jump, in 1937, it was when she first made her contact with Surrealism through seeing an exhibition in London of Max Ernst's work, and then becoming Ernst's muse and lover and escaping to France, escaping her bourgeois family to go to France with him. This is a work from 1941, which is a moment in which the Surrealists transferred, if they could, transferred to America. It's almost certainly made in New York rather than in Europe, although Carrington had an extraordinary passage out of France into America. She was living with Ernst in the Ardèche in sort of mid-southern France. Ernst, as a German citizen, was interned at the outbreak of war by the French government, and then as a communist and a surrealist was interned by the Germans when after the fall of France. And Carrington basically lost her sense of reality. She didn't know what was going on with Ernst, and was helped over the border into Spain by some friends, but then was committed to an asylum and given sort of hallucinogenic drugs to try and calm her down, which of course had completely the opposite effect, and which she describes in this extraordinary book called Down Below, a book I'd very much recommend you lay your hands on, and which she tries to give a clear picture of basically losing your mind in this strange process. She got saved from the asylum by her family sending her nanny, as far as I remember the story goes, to get her out. But she, instead of returning to England, married a Mexican diplomat as a marriage of convenience and left for Mexico. Bizarrely sort of encountering Ernst once again as he escaped out of Europe in that way. But behind all of that, there's this way in which Carrington builds imagery from a number of different sources, from fairy tales, from the myths that she was recounted by her nanny, and also a sort of inherent surrealist vision combining in her work in a very forceful way. She became one of the most revered artists of her generation in Mexico, and as some of you may have seen recently, a new book has just been written about her life by her cousin, actually, which was launched a week or so ago. So that brings us back to another moment, one of my favourite moments, and those of you who've heard me talk before will know there are many jolly stories attached to this. This is the one of the lectures at the International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936 in London. Probably this is the 1st of July. I can tell you that because there is the person in the diving suit, which is, of course, famously Salvador Dalí, who said that he needed to wear a diving suit in order to descend into the subconscious. And famously, also, he got himself locked in and started being asphyxiated This is obviously after that, because they managed to take off the front part to let some air in. But here he is surrounded by a number of the people associated with the exhibition. This is E.L.T. Messens, the Belgian gallery owner, a friend of Magritte, who helped hang the exhibition. And on the left here, Paul and Nouche Eloire, who were close friends of Dali and who helped form the exhibition in 1936. I can't quite remember why I put all of this in, but let's have a look. Those of you who know the collection very well will see that that is Paul Nash's Harbour and Room, and over here Roland Penrose's The Last Voyage of Captain Cook, the bust of Venus in a sort of globe. On the left, interestingly, coincidentally, a Brancusi lent by the then Tate curator, Jim Eade. On the opposite wall, we know, because this is quite well photographed, this space, was another work in the Tate collection, Magritte's Annunciation. Why am I telling you all of this? This is another sort of pivotal moment, I suppose, in the way in which one might look at the art of this period, because it is one of the first moments in which Surrealism reaches out across across Europe. 1936, a crucial moment. There were exhibitions of Surrealism in Tenerife, slightly bizarrely, in Prague and in London. These were prior to the Surrealists organising their own exhibition in Paris, which fell at the end of 1938. And it brought together a lot of different constituent elements. And we've tried in the Surrealist rooms that we've had here at Tate Modern to give a sense of some of the ways in which the exhibition was hung. You can see next to the Nash is a Tanguy, and above that a De Chirico. They mixed up all the artists so as not to give sort of concentrated focus on different artists' work, but to give a sense of the totality of the sort of potential of a surreal world. This is, of course, quite a dangerous world at that moment, and the other things going on in the world include, within weeks actually of Dali speaking in London, Franco had invaded southern Spain, and the Spanish Civil War broke out. And artists turned to their own means to try to provide support for the Spanish Republic. Again, a convenient date here. We're now 80 years ago. It's like a sort of countdown, isn't it? 80 years ago, the French had organised an international exhibition in Paris at which the Spanish pavilion, designed by Josep Maria Sert, included a huge mural by Miro and, of course, a huge mural by Picasso, bless him. And this was sort of set up as the official Spanish pavilion, because the Republican government was still the official government in 1937, but needing to justify its own position in relation to the arts. Picasso, as you probably know, was officially named director of the Prado in absentia, as it were. He didn't return to Spain to take up the directorship. But there was a big sort of cultural debate going on about whether the Republican side had been desecrating convents, stripping out artworks and selling them, all those sorts of things. What had actually happened was that the Prado was packed up and put into storage because the nationalist forces were bombarding Madrid. And then in April 1937, famously the German Condor Legion flattened Guernica. the capital of the Basque Country. And this was the trigger for this famous exercise in trying to condense that sense of outrage and sense of the vulnerability of the civilian population. The painting now is in the Reina Sofia in Madrid, as many of you will know, and they've just opened a sort of 80-year exhibition looking at the build-up to Guernica and the aftermath in Picasso's work. Very interesting to see how he's responding to long themes in his work and immediate inspiration, a sort of ideal mix of things going on. Miró, for his part, made a huge mural called The Reaper, and this actually quite small print, you can see it was, he actually imagined that it was going to be issued as a 1 franc stamp, which people would buy, and it just even, 1 franc would help support Spain, and famously added his text at the bottom here, which I will read out in English. In the present struggle, I see on the fascist side spent forces. On the opposite side, the people whose boundless creative will gives Spain an impetus which will astonish the world. Quite poignant in the circumstances. Of course, the Republic got completely flattened by Franco, and by 1939, the non-intervention of Britain and France allowed Franco to be recognised as his regime to be recognised as the official government in Spain. So Miró had to wait a long time before that sense of conviction that the Spanish people would be vindicated would come true. The other thing I wanted to show you, just while we're thinking about, maybe we could jump on one more, thinking about 1937, is that actually the prize-winning pavilion in 1937, and with the gold medal artist, was in fact Alexander Dejneker, showing in the Russian pavilion. And a sort of sea change had just occurred in Russian painting at that stage, in particular around the debates around socialist realism. And in the early part of the 30s, the impetus to make realism the official literary style, in other words, that one couldn't sort of just fantasize, one had to speak to a certain sort of realism that could be intelligible to the whole of the populace, had transferred into painting. Interesting sort of sideline there is the schism that occurred in surrealism at that moment, in that one of the founding figures of surrealism alongside André Breton was Louis Aragon. And Aragon, writer, poet, committed surrealist, sort of switched sides to embrace this Stalinist aesthetic, and thereafter wrote about this sort of socialist realism, a sort of realism that is celebratory, uplifting, essentially propagandizing. The Stakhanovites are named after somebody Stakhanovich, I can't remember his first name, who was reputedly voluntarily worked overtime to outstrip the targets that he had been set. And this generated a whole sort of body of people who would sign up to be Stakhanovites, to work even harder to build the new socialist republic. And there he is with Lenin pointing in the right direction. It's quite a strange space that Dejneker built here. You'll probably have seen his works in the exhibition at the Royal Academy at the moment. Some absolutely extraordinary things. One of those sort of frieze-like paintings of industrial workers, a slightly thrown away painting of footballers that got got dumped in the last gallery in a rather disgraceful way, but we won't comment on other people's exhibitions. This was really set up vast hall, built specially to accommodate 3 big paintings. And this one was standing behind a massive sculpture of Stalin, inevitably. When it comes to the exhibition that we'll open in the autumn, that will mark the acquisition of the David King collection of Russian and other material, and also will open actually on the anniversary of the October Revolution. The studies for these paintings will be included. We're borrowing those from a museum in Pelham. I think that may be a secret, but I've told you now. And that leads us very easily to, although a bit of a jump in date, to Léger. Léger is an interesting figure in this debate, because in 1936-37, Léger and Aragon, who I've just mentioned, and Le Corbusier, the architect, were involved in something that was called the querelle du réalisme, the quarrel around realism. Whether you could be a committed artist politically, and what that meant about the style in which you painted. And Léger remained on the side of including something intelligible, not going over as far as Danica in terms of that sort of strict celebratory realism, but something a bit more that still anchored in reality. And Léger is rather significant for that reason, coming out of Cubism in the First World War and carrying on, joining, as Picasso did in 1945, joining the Communist Party in France and really saying, well, we need to make a body of work that can be open, understood, and supportive of ordinary people. One reason for including Léger is that he had an extremely important international studio where people came to study. And the range of people is rather extraordinary. There were lots of, at one stage, lots of Scandinavian artists were working there in the 1930s. And then in the post-war moment, artists like Choucair passed through his studio. And those of you who've been through the galleries in recent years will know that Choucair is a figure who has sort of started to permeate our displays now, having had a concentrated exhibition, whenever that was, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Now, seeing her work in that broader context allows us to think more widely about the position of artists in the world. Choucair came from Beirut, studied with Léger in Paris, and made that into her own response to her local culture in Beirut when she returned there, building in responses to Le Corbusier's architecture, to the traditions of Islam in terms of its rhythms of poetry, but also its unitary structure. You can see that essentially this is almost like a sort of, it isn't, but it's almost like a cutout that can be flipped around through the composition and show rhythmic qualities. And amongst the other artists, we don't have one in the collection, I don't have a slide, but just to give you a sense of the range of Léger's studio, was Tarsila de Amaral, the Brazilian modernist who worked in Léger's studio in the 1930s. So you can see that this is one of those crossing points that gives you a sense of, once you start recognizing the names and seeing the works, you can see that there's actually a wider network of practices and connections. And those are the sorts of things that we're trying to dig into a little bit in the way that we rethink the telling of 20th century art. And then another story, I suppose. also going back almost to an anniversary. This is rather lying in parallel to the story around surrealism and Dalí speaking on the 1st of July 1936. Self-consciously artists thinking about the place of abstract art in contrast to surrealism. And the artists involved with abstract and concrete, in particular those who were involved with a publication called Circle, really wanted to set themselves apart from surrealism. They thought surrealism was rather sort of, they were just fantasists, doing slightly obscene things, perhaps dubious politically. This was something that was, as it were, pure modernism. And at the heart of it were artists such as Mondrian, of course. This is composition B with red that's upstairs on the wall. Jean Hélion, Barbara Hepworth, there's another Hélion there, floating above them, a Calder, and in the centre here, a Ben Nicholson. One of the drivers behind this was also Namgabo. And you can see here that this was, well, what can one say, slightly thrown together as an exhibition. I particularly like this arrangement, which is not quite the ideal way to show your Mondrians across the dado rail, but nevertheless, sort of breathtakingly revolutionary, though, for that moment. It was put together, this is in the Lefebvre Gallery in London, but it travelled around to a number of cities, Manchester, Liverpool, and somewhere else, can't quite remember, sorry. Taking on different, Oxford, because it came from the person from Oxford who put it together. That will come back to me. But gathering the most up to the moment sorts of works, particularly from Paris. The story is that Winifred Nicholson bought this painting from Mondrian in 1935, I think a year before the exhibition. It was one of only 3 works that he had managed to sell that year. And if you think that the broader context beyond surrealism and Spanish Civil War is the Depression, the economic depression, selling pristine abstract paintings was quite an uphill struggle. So Mondrian, particularly Mondrian and Hélion, both were very, very poor at this stage, incredibly poor, but still stuck to their guns on making these works. Some others, I think actually the British artists were slightly better off. The crisis in the Parisian art market was rather more acute than it was in London. And Hepworth made this fantastic sculpture at that moment. And as you saw, was represented in abstract and concrete by it. And this is one of those works that gives a sense of her response to and extension of what she had encountered in Paris when she went to visit Nicholson there, and interestingly, visiting Brancusi's studio. All the best stories go round in circles. Another of the drivers, of course, is Namgabo, and this interesting work, which we also have on display upstairs, was published in Circle. And he described it not strictly speaking as a work itself, but as it says there, kinetic construction, but as a sort of experiment in creating form through movement. So when it's turned off, it is just a standing wire. When you put electricity through it, it makes the form. And this, rather like Duchamp setting off conceptual art, this sets off a whole train of work in which movement is brought back into, or is brought into sculptural form, whether it's by Calder allowing air movement to spin his mobiles just at this moment, or in the case of Gabo, bringing technology to play. Gabo had been trained as an engineer. He studied engineering at Moscow University before moving into becoming an artist in the moment just around the moment of the Russian Revolution, and then published a slightly deceptively titled Realist Manifesto in 1920 with his brother Antoine Pevsner, where essentially they said, well, the real is something that is created new. So this is a different sort of reality. This isn't the reality of socialist realism reflecting the outside world, but building a new world entirely. So Gabo came from that same revolutionary moment, but diverges from it in a way that, for someone like Däniken, would not be acceptable, recognisable, politically allowed. Which meant that Gabo makes that sort of traditional westward movement out of Russia, first of all to Berlin in the early 1920s, then to Paris in about 1925-26, and then to London in 37-38, and ultimately, after the war, having spent some time in Carbis Bay outside St Ives, on to the United States. But this is sort of critical work in triggering that whole stream of practice. That seemed like a good idea at the time, but you all know that work. And I've already talked about that. What else have we got here? I can see that I'm running out of time already. Ah, yes, this incredibly bleached out image is of Winifred Nicholson's 48 Quai d'Auteuil, which is the address of her house in sort of west of the Eiffel Tower on the river, where she decamped, having split up with Ben Nicholson, and she became friends with a number of Parisian artists whose work she acquired, but also whose work she responded to in making her own abstract works. And those of you at the back will hardly be able to see this, but best to go upstairs and have a look at it in person, probably quite quickly, because when we reopen St Ives with the expanded galleries in the autumn, this work will be taken out of our displays to go west, rather like Gabo did. I put in Elian's Ile-de-France. That was also in that same photograph of abstract and concrete, because Elian's also an interesting figure, an artist who makes this connection between Europe and America. He started going to America in the early 30s. The Ile-de-France obviously is the region around Paris. It's also the name of a transatlantic liner. And I think that's probably more what's going on here. This is pre-aeroplanes. If you wanted to go to America, you needed to set aside 3.5, 4 days to catch the fastest boat from Le Havre to New York. And you get that from that sort of sheen of the areas that appear to be bent metal. Obviously, it's all a painted surface. Give you that sense of this is cutting-edge modernity. Confusing, yes. So Elian went to America. Confusingly, he married a woman called Jean, which makes telling them apart in their letters quite exciting. And he also managed to be plugged in to the growing network of abstract painters working in New York, and actually just sort of go-between America and Europe. Came to London, was friendly with Nicholson and John Piper and others. But then he has a sort of actually really bizarre crisis of conscience. And around this time, he starts secretly painting realistic paintings. It's almost, and when you read his diaries, it's almost as if he feels it's a self-betrayal, let alone a betrayal of all the people that he's stood up for, saying, yes, abstract art is the new vision, this is the building a new world. And he's secretly painting portraits. That's slightly abstracted, but nevertheless. And it's he sort of undergoes this crisis over a period of about a decade. It's not really until the post-war moment that he sort of comes out as a realist painter again, which is sort of the opposite story to a lot of artists that we're familiar with. So if you thought of a British artist, for instance, Victor Passmore, had started as a realist artist, caused a great controversy around 1950 by suddenly becoming an abstract painter. And there was a big sort of fuss about it. Well, you can imagine the sort of opposite fuss going on in Paris around Jean Hélion, and the readoption of a realist style. And that's why I thought I'd drop in this. One of the most bizarre works in our collection, really, for many reasons. When we first showed this, which was shortly after Tate Modern opened, you can see we were given it in 2000. I think we put it on display in about 2001. And actually, I can remember we had it in the gallery, which is currently the View from Tokyo gallery. It needs to be, as you know, needs to have a big space. And I took a French colleague in there, and he was just absolutely dumbfounded that this work was first of all, on the wall of a museum at all, and secondly, on the wall of a museum in London. Because this was a totally notorious work when it was first exhibited in 1953. It's called Atlantic Civilization, and it is what Danica's socialist realism had become by the mid-50s. Something rather more hard-hitting, obviously from a French perspective, Fougeron is a committed French communist. Interestingly, and here we are again, another loop round, supported by Louis Aragon, who was by that stage one of the leading intellectual figures of the Communist Party in France. But you can see what's going on here. You've got a GI reading, you probably can't see because it's slightly out of focus, reading a girly magazine. There's an enormous car here, something like a sort of Studebaker or something, with an American soldier in it, but they're rolling over the top of refugees who are living under corrugated iron below. Meanwhile, French posters for paratroops being sent to the French colonial wars, which was still going on at that moment. Indochina, the war that became the Vietnam War when the French were still fighting it, but also the wars going on in North Africa. And so Fougeron thought, well, I'm making this absolutely a sort of grand statement about the injustices of the, Atlantic civilization. Everyone thought he'd gone a bit far. And even Aragon, who was one of his key supporters, said, this is actually this has gone over the top in criticising and caricaturing, I suppose, the place of America in the world. And from that moment, that's an interesting moment. Fougeron sort of drops away as being an acceptable artist of the left in France. And it coincides with a number of other factors that go on at that moment. Within 3 years, you've got the Hungarian uprising, which gets put down by the Soviet regime, and so there's a crisis, a political crisis of the left as to how communism could be seen to be supporting the will of the people, and yet tanks are rolling into Budapest. So Fougeron's star sort of falls catastrophically at that stage. Hence, I suppose, the astonishment of my colleague when he saw it in our galleries. But I think it's an important work. We know it's a historically important work, but I think it's an important work for the ways in which we think about the variety of visual culture at those particular moments. And as you know, we have it upstairs really in a face-off with the works that we've come to accept as being sort of standard pop images, to slightly open up the cracks between what it means to be working with an essentially realist-based form of picture making, which is at the heart of what pop is about, and how you can push that further and see where politics enters in. So part of the reason for doing that was to follow the legacy of The World Goes Pop, the exhibition that we had a couple of years ago, but also to extend those questions and to see how much one can rethink that moment. Got a few more images and a few more minutes. That's virtually impossible to see. Sorry. But I just wanted to touch upon another set of works where we're trying to look at sort of closely held, or closely, maybe not closely held, is quite the right word, where similar sorts of approaches seem to converge. And this is one of the galleries which I think has been most successful in that, called The Disappearing Figure, which looks at the immediate post-war moment. And that sense of, here in The Death of the Sun, a sense of the very real fear of total annihilation in the atomic era. And that sense that it is, here you have it almost again, but slightly the other way round in Gregorian's The Creation of the Planet, something that there's almost a sort of cosmic powers going on here, which man is very close to controlling or being unable to control. And there was an acute sense of foreboding in that moment, which I'm glad to say we seem to have stepped away a little bit from in the last decade or so, couple of decades. Whether we verge back in that direction or not, one certainly hopes not. But it was a binding concern in that period. And so with Koo Lim Kim, a Korean artist in the previous image, this sort of the sense that can be transferred into a material form here with some sort of burnt surface, almost like tar applied to the surface of the canvas, or in the Gregorian here. I know that our conservators have had a challenging time with this work. It seems to be made up actually of earth, sort of glued together with stuff. Quite difficult to conserve, certainly difficult to restore. But a sense that something about the matter of the material that goes into making art was going through a revolutionary period at that moment as people tried to meet the challenge of how to make art after the Second World War, the atomic bombs, the Holocaust. And of course, more familiar works, I suppose, that we've been showing for a greater length of time can be included in that way of looking at the world. And so to have Lee Krasner on display, or the great Richiers in the middle of that room, give you a sense of how, if we look a bit wider into the world, there are other artists who are responding in their own ways and taking those issues a little bit further. I skipped over the Ernest Mancoba. Interesting artist. South African artist who came to Europe and worked in the sort of Circle of Cobra, the group that, one of the groups that came out of late Surrealism and adopted a sort of wider vision of interesting sources, children's art, the art of the insane, a more spontaneous production. But he's a person who slightly got written out of that history. So we know about Constant and Appel, but an African seemed to be an artist who could be set to one side. And it's only in recent years that Mancoba's come back into that narrative, and I think we're, in many senses, trying to catch up on trying to see that wider perspective on the world and to include such artists who were there all along, but we sort of somehow ignored. I mentioned Constant, there's the Constant. And I suppose in that connection, Bacon isn't on the wall, but Bacon sort of sets the tone for someone like Ibrahim El-Salahi as well, whose work was, probably know the story of this work, but it's a work that he made, he comes from the Sudan. It's a work that he made recalling his earliest experiences of growing up in the Sudan and having musicians and people reciting the Quran in his house. His father ran a Quranic school, but that it can be drawn together, drawn out in an image that is entirely his own. It's nevertheless got connections with rethinking that post-war moment and rethinking the way in which the body is depicted, rethinking what it means to make art, and where those sort of centres of art might reside. I think I've talked for too long. It is already 6 minutes to 6. But I think I'd just end on the one last image, which is Gustav Metzger's Liquid Crystal Environment. Metzger, as many of you will know, died about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And there will be a memorial service more or less straight after this, I think. But just it seemed in the run of anniversaries, which I began with, it seemed appropriate to end with Gustav. So there, totally random set of thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So we've got, this is the end of the talk. So for those of you who come along for the talk, thank you very much. We're going to have a short break before the next part of our guides training continues for those new guides and buddy guides. So we'll have a short break for 15 minutes and then we'll sort of be ready to go at 1:15. If anyone would like to stay anyway and have a tea or coffee, some biscuits, that includes you, Matthew, as well, if you'd like to. We've got lots of biscuits.
I think I'll have to get to my next event, but thank you for listening.